Okay, we're talking about mathematical challenges to modern evolutionary theory, and in particular, we're talking about the problem of complex adaptation. The reason it's a problem is you have to get lots of things together, none of which on its own would be beneficial in order to get some new thing. If you want to have an innovation, a new enzyme, a new protein that does something, a new gene that does something else, typically, the way we think about invention, you're going to have to arrange a lot of things before you get a prototype, before you get something that works at all, and then possibly natural selection could work on that thing once it works and perfect it. It could optimize, but it can't invent. So that's widely recognized as a problem. The paper by Behe and Snoke that came out in 2004 kind of put that out there as a mathematical problem and gave their mathematical analysis of it that showed that yes, indeed, the time you have to wait for a complex adaptation can be extremely long, even longer than evolutionary timescales. A number of other people have weighed in on this now from various angles and has recognized there is indeed a problem with complex adaptation. The angle that evolutionists are trying to take is, well, you don't really need that many mutations to be combined. Maybe things can happen with just two and usually just one. But there again, they're trying to reduce the leap, move it back to stepping stones. We've already seen that stepping stones can have a problem. So it's going to require leaps to get innovations, to get true inventions. Well, just the fact that you have to get multiple things together in order to have something new is the main challenge. But what might overcome this challenge? Well, if you think about anything that is very rare, like winning the lottery, it's very unlikely if you buy a single lottery ticket that you're going to win. But what could you do in order to improve your odds of winning? What you could do is spend an awful lot of money on the lottery and buy lots and lots and lots of lottery tickets. I don't recommend this, but obviously the more you buy, the better your odds are. It's never going to pay off because you'd have to spend millions of dollars on lottery tickets in order to hope to win. But clearly, if something is very unlikely to happen, you can increase the likelihood by increasing the number of opportunities for it to happen. In other words, if something is 1 in a million to happen in one try, then in a million tries, it becomes quite probable that it will happen. And in multiple millions of tries, it becomes very likely that it will happen. So the one way that populations that are evolving could overcome this probabilistic hurdle of complex adaptation is simply by having lots and lots and lots and lots of opportunities to beat the odds. So if you think about it that way, it's kind of a contest between the improbability of doing something very, very rare that would give you something exciting and interesting in terms of innovation, inventing a new protein, inventing some new feature, versus the number of opportunities for it to happen. The fact that this is so rare means it's probably not going to happen in one try. It's probably going to require lots and lots of tries. So it's a matter of stacking up a number of tries that actually can conquer the improbability of the complex adaptation. So if you think about natural populations, what are the things that are a challenge in terms of stacking up lots and lots of opportunities? Well, it's all the things that make the number of individuals small. Or on the flip side, what would solve this problem? It would be lots and lots and lots of individuals. What are the challenges in terms of parameters when you look at a population? One of them is that mutation rates have to be low. Another one is that populations tend not to be all that large. And another challenge is that generation times can be so long that there's quite a bit of time between one generation and the next. So let's look at mutation rate. I had a dialogue with an evolutionary biologist named Robert Shapiro, who's passed away a few years ago, who said, when we were in face-to-face discussion on this, and he said, well, you can solve that problem just by jacking up the mutation rate. And I said, you can't jack up the mutation rate arbitrarily. There are limits to mutation rate because every organism has a big chunk of their genome that they have to preserve and faithfully pass on to the next generation. When you're talking about complex adaptation, you tend to think of it as, okay, here's a target gene where we want to invent something new, so let's hit that with lots and lots of mutations and hope that something new comes out. But remember, Evolution is not planning, it's not discerning, it's not forward thinking. It has no way of saying, here's the gene I want to mutate, I want to protect these genes. There has to be one mutation rate over the whole genome, and it has to be uniform. So the problem is you have to preserve a big chunk of the functional genome that you need to work and hope that a few mutations happen to hit the ones that you want to change. So if this is where invention has to happen, this has to be preserved. There's no way to distinguish those for evolution. The whole genome is the whole genome. Mutation hits the whole thing. If you have a high mutation rate, you kill the organism because you lost the information that you have to preserve. For that reason, mutation rates have to be low because species wouldn't survive if they go beyond a certain rate that's called the error catastrophe rate. If they're beyond a rate where you start having multiple mutations in the important part of the genome every generation, then you can no longer have successful propagation of the genome and you lose information and you go extinct. Mutation rates have to be low. Populations tend not to be as high as you might think of them. And generation times can actually be quite long. If you take large, complex organisms, we could look at humans. Humans are actually kind of an anomaly in that for large organisms, we have a very large population, or at least it's grown to a very large population. If you look at other organisms that are large, like us, they tend to have much smaller populations. Brown bears, for example, are all over the place. They're not considered an endangered species. There's a lot of them. But would you believe there's only about 200,000 estimated brown bears on the planet alive today? That's not a huge number. It's a small city by human standards. 200,000 brown bears, and they live about 2 generations, so they live to be grandparents roughly before they die. And that means to keep this population going, the brown bear population going in steady state, they need to have about 1,000 cubs born per generation. Generation time for the brown bear is about 10 years, so you need only about 10,000 cubs born every year to keep the global population of brown bears going, okay? And for the most part, we assume that that's what's happening. Populations reach a steady state, they grow to a certain steady state, and then they're just, birth is compensating for death. Organisms are dying, individuals are dying, and individuals are being born at the same rate so that you have a steady population size. 10,000 cubs being born per year to keep the brown bear population going. That's only about 28 per day. That's about 1 cub per hour. So only one new organism in this species per hour keeps the whole global population at a steady level of about 200,000 bears. That's not a whole lot of organisms. If you think of that in terms of trials, remember, we're trying to beat the odds on something that's extremely hard to beat, very, very low probabilities. 1 chance per hour, that's all you get. There's only 1 cub being born every hour. That's not a lot of opportunities to beat very, very low odds. We're going to look at an organism that, if anything is going to beat the odds, it would be this kind of organism next. Okay, we're talking about mathematical challenges to the modern theory of evolution. And we're talking in particular about a challenge that's called the challenge of complex adaptation. How you would get lots of things lined up and have no payoff for any one of these intermediates, but only get your working prototype at the end after you've lined these things up. Specifically, how you would get several changes to DNA together at once to produce some new function. We expect that to do something clever, anything clever, you're going to have to do this. You're not going to get anything in a gradualistic way that Darwin conceived. We've already eliminated that. We've also said that one mutation at a time, step by step by step by step, pathways are very unlikely. You're not going to be able to go from function to function to function unless you're able to arrange functions in a miraculous way. So if you're going to talk about arranging functions in a miraculous way, arranging these stepping stones in a designed, in a highly intelligent, a highly clever way, then you might as well just say that life is cleverly designed. So the challenge for people who are saying that life isn't cleverly designed, that it happened by accident, is to explain how these new fantastic features came about. And complex adaptation has become the mathematical version of this challenge. Well, so in the last lesson, we said you can think of this as a contest really between a very, very, very daunting improbability, the improbability of getting things lined up to produce a new feature. This could be a very low number, very low probability. And the only way you could combat that probability apart from intelligent action is to have a very, very, very large number of chances to beat this probability. We said if winning the lottery is a 1 in a million chance, then if you buy 1 million tickets, and I don't recommend that, then you have a decent chance of winning the lottery. If you buy 10 million, you've got a very good chance of winning the lottery. So no matter how low this number is, in principle, in theory, mathematically, there could be enough trials, enough opportunities to overcome a very, very low probability. But then when we look at complex organisms, real populations, we're not thinking that we have the numbers that are going to stack up against very low probabilities. We looked at the brown bear as an example population, a very successful species that's doing well in the wild, despite the fact that the numbers aren't all that large, about 200,000 of these bears, and we estimated that about 1 new cub is born every hour on average, and that's enough, although that's not a very high birth rate, that's enough to keep this population going. It's not enough, though, to beat a very, very, very small probability. So we're guessing that in a brown bear population, you're not going to get a complex adaptation. You're not going to get brown bears developing bat-like sonar or some new novel feature coming out in brown bears, because there just aren't that many being born. And if it's extremely improbable for a new feature to exist in any one, then you're going to have a whole lot more than that being born. What I want to do now is consider the species on the planet that would be the very, very most potent in terms of evolving, in terms of getting new complex adaptations. And that would be the species that has the largest numbers, that has a small genome size so it can sustain a fairly high mutation rate, and that has a very short generation time. You're probably already thinking that this is going to be a bacterial species, and it is. All of the bacterial species have a massive advantage in terms of sheer numbers. And the most abundant of these on the planet is an oceanic bacterium that's widespread in all the oceans of the earth. It's estimated that there are about 10 to the 28th power of these organisms on the planet. That's 10 billion, huge number of these organisms, and that they go through a generation time of about a day. So every day you replace that population of 10 to the 28 with 10 to the 28 new cells, 10 billion births per day as compared to 28 for the brown bear. There is no comparison. Okay. Another advantage of this organism is that, like all bacteria, it's got a modest genome size. They're measured in millions of base pairs. I'm not sure I mentioned base pairs, but if you take the A's, C's, G's, and T's in DNA, those are the 4 letters that make up the DNA alphabet. Each of those is called a base, and because DNA is a double helix, the bases are always paired. One strand, the A pairs with the T, or the C pairs with the G. So in bacteria, you have these modest genome sizes measured in millions of base pairs, whereas in complex organisms, they tend to be measured in billions of base pairs. Or if you look at the number of protein-coding genes, in bacteria, it tends to be around 1,000 or a few thousand for free-living species. For complex life forms like that brown bear, for us, it's tens of thousands of protein-coding genes. So you can see that for the simple bacterium, it's possible to have a mutation rate that's quite a bit higher and still preserve your 1,000 genes. Whereas if you're a brown bear or any complex organism, you've got to preserve a whole lot more than 1,000 genes, which means you can sustain only a much more modest mutation rate. Why do we care about that? Well, if you want to get these complex adaptations, you need mutations to happen. And so we're concerned with how they could happen as fast as possible. It's not going to be in a brown bear. It's going to be in a bacterial population. So all of these reasons add up to say that a bacterial species is going to be the most potent evolver on the planet by far. Now, it's interesting that some reasons have been given for complex life to be good at evolving, and one of the key ones is sexual reproduction. Bacteria are asexual reproducers. Cells grow, and then they divide. So daughter cells, in theory, contain exactly the same DNA sequence as the mother cell. Not so in sexually reproducing populations. Now, why would sexual reproduction possibly benefit evolution? Well, the reasons given are that you have this shuffling of genes. You have recombination of genes in the production of gametes, in sperm and egg, and then you have two lines of genes that come together in sexual reproducing populations. Mother and father give their genes to produce offspring, so offspring receives DNA from both parents, and the DNA from each in the gametes is not exactly the same as the DNA that either parent had on their separate chromosomes, because you have this shuffling, you have this genetic recombination that takes place in the production of the gametes. But that shuffling, although it might be significant in some respects, it's significant in that it brings together things that already exist. It's not going to compare to the overwhelming numerical advantage of bacterial populations. There's some things that shuffling does, but the overwhelming numerical advantage lies with bacterial species. And for that reason, I think hands down, bacterial species are going to be the very most potent evolvers. So think of it this way. If you believe that evolution works, and you believe that it can pass any mathematical test put to it, you probably don't want to look at bacteria. You want to look at the most challenging population and say, I'm going to prove that in the blue whale population, complex adaptation is not a problem. Not many people are that confident that it does work. Nobody's going out there and showing that complex adaptation can work in the blue whale population. If, on the other hand, you're more like my inclination, which is I don't think it does work, then you want to look at the population where if it does work anywhere, it's going to work in this population, and that's the bacterial population. So for that reason, very early on, I became most interested in bacterial populations because I believe if complex adaptation does not work there, then it doesn't work anywhere.